For years, he was ignored, ridiculed, and underestimated. But today, everything changes. When the CEO mocked him in front of the entire office, no one expected what happened next. And in just 5 minutes, the man who thought he was untouchable would be the one packing his bags. Stay till the end to witness a moment that no one in that building will ever forget. If you believe in justice, like, comment, and share. The hum of office chatter faded the moment Jordan stepped into the boardroom. The tension in the air was thick, pressing against him like a wall. Every eye in the room flickered to him before quickly turning away, as if his presence was an inconvenience, a minor disruption in their world of power suits and silent agreements. But today, he wasn't here to be ignored. At the head of the long, polished conference table, Stephen Marshall, the CEO of the company, sat reclined in his chair. His posture screamed arrogance, one arm draped over the chair, a smirk playing on his lips as if he had already won some unspoken game. The moment Jordan entered, Marshall's smirk widened. Well, he drawled, folding his hands together. The intern with ambitions, should I be flattered or annoyed? Jordan clenched his jaw but kept his expression unreadable. He wasn't an intern, not anymore. He had climbed his way up, worked twice as hard as anyone in the room. Yet, to Marshall, he was still a joke. Just another employee who didn't belong. "I heard you wanted to see me," Jordan said, keeping his voice calm. Marshall let out a slow chuckle. "Oh, I don't just see employees like you. I observe, like an experiment." He leaned forward, his blue eyes glinting with amusement. "Tell me, Jordan, do you really think you deserve that promotion?" The room fell silent. A few executives exchanged awkward glances, but no one spoke up. They never did. They had watched this scene play out before. Marshall picking apart someone he deemed unworthy, reducing them to nothing. Jordan exhaled slowly. He had prepared for this. He had spent months gathering everything he needed. He wasn't going to let Marshall walk all over him today. "I don't think," Jordan said, stepping closer to the table. "I know." The smirk on Marshall's face faltered for half a second, but he recovered quickly. He scoffed, shaking his head. "Confidence, cute. But let's not pretend you've gotten this far on merit. You should be grateful we even let you sit at this table." A few people around the table shifted uncomfortably. Jordan caught the flicker of something, maybe guilt, in their eyes, but still no one spoke. Marshall leaned back again, stretching as if this conversation bored him. "Look, I'm not saying you don't have potential, Jordan. Maybe in another lifetime, at another company. But here?" He chuckled. "A junior executive at best. That's your ceiling. You should know that by now." Jordan felt the blood pounding in his ears, but he refused to let his anger show. That's what Marshall wanted, to see him break, but not today. He reached into his pocket, his fingers wrapping around the folded papers he had been carrying for this exact moment. He placed them on the table and slid them across to Marshall. The CEO raised a brow, then unfolded the document. As his eyes skimmed over the words, the amusement drained from his face. His grip on the paper tightened. Jordan finally let a small smile creep onto his lips. "Actually, Stephen," he said, his voice steady, "I think you should be more worried about your own position." For the first time, the room felt like it was holding its breath. Something was about to happen that Marshall never saw coming. The silence in the room was deafening. The executives sitting around the table looked between Jordan and Marshall, their faces shifting from curiosity to something closer to unease. No one had ever spoken to the CEO like that before. Not, and survived in this company. Marshall's fingers tightened around the paper, his knuckles turning white. His confident smirk had vanished, replaced by something far more interesting: uncertainty. "What the hell is this?" he finally said, his voice lower now, controlled but laced with irritation. Jordan didn't answer right away. He let the weight of the moment stretch, let Marshall feel the same discomfort he had made so many others feel over the years. Then, slowly, deliberately, he pulled out his phone and slid it onto the table. Marshall's jaw tightened as he glanced at it, then back at Jordan. "You think waving a few papers in my face is going to scare me?" Jordan leaned forward slightly. "You should read it." Marshall scoffed, but his eyes betrayed him. He skimmed through the first few lines, then stopped. His breath hitched for just a second, but it was enough. A cold wave of realization swept over his face. Across the table, a few of the other executives shifted in their seats, trying to catch a glimpse of what had rattled their untouchable CEO. "This is a joke," Marshall muttered, shaking his head. "There's no way." Jordan tilted his head. "It's all there, every unethical deal, every falsified report, every time you buried complaints about your behavior." Marshall's eyes flickered back to the document, scanning frantically as if he could somehow will it to disappear. Jordan let the silence stretch before speaking again. "Did you think no one was paying attention?" he asked, his voice calm. "That no one was watching while you used this company like your personal empire? You've stepped on people for years, but you got careless, Stephen, and now you're out of time." Marshall's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. But then, just as quickly as the fear appeared, he forced himself to laugh. It was hollow, forced. "You really think what? Some file is going to bring me down?" He leaned back in his chair again, forcing his smirk to return. "You have no idea how this game works, do you, Jordan? You don't just walk in here and—" A buzzing sound cut through the air. Marshall's smirk wavered as his phone vibrated against the table. He glanced at it, and for the first time, genuine panic crossed his face. Jordan didn't have to look. He already knew what it was. "That would be the board," Jordan said, crossing his arms. "I'd answer if I were you." Marshall's face darkened. His hands hovered over the phone, but he hesitated. Jordan took a step closer. "Oh, and just so you know," he added, his voice dropping slightly, "this meeting, it's being recorded." A single bead of sweat rolled down Marshall's temple. This was it. The moment the mighty CEO realized the game was no longer in his control. And Jordan? He was just getting started. Marshall's fingers twitched over his phone, but he didn't pick it up. The vibrating stopped, leaving only the low hum of the office lights and the faint sound of someone shifting uncomfortably in their chair. The air in the boardroom had changed. The executives weren't just watching now, they were waiting. Jordan could see it in their eyes. Some were intrigued, others nervous, but none of them looked at Marshall the same way they had before. The shift had begun. Marshall let out a slow breath, setting the document down with forced casualness. "You think you're smart, don't you?" His voice was quieter now, his usual arrogance chipped at the edges. "But let me tell you something, Jordan." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "I built this company. People like you come and go, you don't last." Jordan smiled slightly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You built this company?" he repeated. He let the words settle before shaking his head. "No, Stephen, you didn't build anything. You just sat at the top while everyone else did the work." Marshall's eyes darkened. Jordan placed his palms on the table and leaned in slightly, matching his stare. "The difference between you and me? I earned my place here, you bought yours." A quiet murmur passed through the room. It was subtle, but it was there. The executives exchanged glances, some shifting in their seats. Jordan could see it happening. The cracks were forming. Marshall clenched his jaw. "Let's get something straight," he said, his voice dangerously low. "I still run this company. I decide who stays and who—" The door swung open. Everyone turned. A woman in a sharp navy blue suit stepped inside, her heels clicking against the polished floor. Denise Carter, the company's head of legal affairs. She was a woman who rarely spoke unless she had something important to say. Today, she looked directly at Marshall with a measured, unreadable expression. "Stephen," she said, her tone clipped. "The board is requesting an immediate meeting, right now." Marshall's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Jordan took a step back, watching him. He wasn't going to say anything else. He didn't need to. The board had just spoken for him. Marshall clenched his fists. He looked at Denise, then at Jordan, then back at the executives around the table. For the first time in years, he looked small, like a man realizing that the power he had always taken for granted was slipping through his fingers. "I'll deal with this," Marshall muttered, grabbing his phone and rising to his feet. He shot a sharp look at Jordan. "This isn't over." Jordan didn't move, didn't blink. "Oh, I think it is," he said quietly. Marshall's nostrils flared, but he didn't respond. He stormed past Denise, shoving the door open with unnecessary force. It slammed shut behind him, leaving behind a room full of silent, waiting eyes. Jordan exhaled, then turned to face them. "Anyone else want to pretend they didn't see this coming?" he asked. No one answered. The game wasn't just changing. It had already changed. The silence in the boardroom stretched, thick with uncertainty. For the first time, Jordan wasn't just another employee fighting to be heard. He was the one everyone was looking to now. Denise was still standing by the door, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. The other executives avoided Jordan's gaze, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. They had followed Marshall for years, basked in his power. But now they were watching him lose everything. Jordan let the moment breathe before speaking. "You all knew," he said, his voice steady but sharp. "You knew exactly what kind of man Marshall was. You knew about the fraud, the shady deals, the way he treated people, and you let it happen." No one spoke. No one dared. Jordan shook his head. "Tell me, was it fear or was it convenience?" One of the older executives, a man named Richard Vaughn, cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. He hesitated, glancing at the others as if searching for backup. "We didn't have proof, and even if we did, Marshall had influence." Jordan raised a brow. "Influence?" he echoed. "You mean power? And now that power is gone, so now you're all suddenly ready to reconsider your positions." More silence. Denise took a step forward, finally breaking it. "The board isn't just reconsidering, Jordan," she said. "They're voting." A murmur swept through the room. Jordan didn't react, but inside, his heart pounded. He had prepared for this moment, but hearing it out loud made it real. Denise glanced at him. "You should come with me." Jordan hesitated. He could feel the weight of the executive's eyes still on him. Some wary, some uncertain, a few almost impressed. Then the door to the boardroom swung open again. Marshall had returned. But he wasn't alone. 2 security guards flanked him, their expressions unreadable. He looked furious, but behind that anger there was something else now, desperation. "The board isn't voting," Marshall spat, his voice venomous, "because there is no board without me." Jordan's eyes locked onto him, his expression unchanging. You sure about that? Marshall let out a cold laugh. I built this company. You think they'll just let me walk away because some junior executive dug up a few bad deals? He scoffed, shaking his head. You're in over your head, kid. Denise didn't flinch. She reached into her folder, pulled out a sealed document, and held it up. Actually, Stephen, the board has already prepared a motion for your removal. Marshall's face twisted in rage. You can't. Jordan took a step forward. They already did. Marshall's mouth snapped shut. For the first time since this started, he looked truly lost. The security guards stepped closer. Mr. Marshall, one of them said, voice firm, you need to come with us. Jordan didn't look away as the realization sank in. The king had just been dethroned, and there wasn't a damn thing he could do about it. Marshall didn't move. His face was a mask of disbelief, his mind racing for a way out. But there was none. The board had turned on him. The company no longer belonged to him. The same power he had wielded over others had just been ripped from his hands. He started to speak but stopped. His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard, his mind grasping at anything, any last shred of control. The security guards stepped in, standing on either side of him. One of them placed a firm hand on his shoulder. Sir, the guard said, voice cold, don't make this harder than it has to be. The entire room was still. No one spoke, no one defended him. For years, Marshall had ruled through intimidation, cutting down anyone who stood in his way. But now, he was the one being dismissed. Jordan stood tall, watching the man who had mocked him, belittled him, and treated him like nothing more than an inconvenience. Not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with clarity. Marshall's hands clenched into fists at his sides. His breathing was sharp, his chest rising and falling quickly. His entire world was collapsing in real time. Then, suddenly, he laughed. It was hollow, bitter. His eyes flickered around the room, landing on every executive who had once followed him without question. You think this is a victory? He sneered, voice laced with venom. You think kicking me out changes anything? His gaze locked onto Jordan, and for the first time, his arrogance cracked just slightly. You really believe they'll follow you? He scoffed, shaking his head. They don't want change. They don't want you. Jordan's face remained calm, unshaken. Maybe, he said evenly. But they sure as hell don't want you either. That hit. Marshall's smirk faltered, the weight of Jordan's words crashing down on him. He turned, looking at the people who had once feared him, who had once hung on to his every word. Now, they wouldn't even meet his eyes. Take him out, Denise said firmly. Marshall stiffened. He had never taken orders, not from anyone. But now he had no choice. The guards moved in, gripping his arms. He tensed for a moment as if considering resisting, but there was no fight left. With one final, sharp breath, Stephen Marshall, the man who thought he was untouchable, was escorted out of his own company. The door slammed shut behind him. The silence that followed was heavy. No one moved, no one spoke. Then, Jordan took his seat. He didn't ask, he didn't hesitate. He simply walked to the head of the table, the seat that had belonged to Marshall for years, and sat down, like he had always belonged there. The executives stared at him, some in shock, others in uncertainty. Jordan looked around the room, his voice steady. So, he said, folding his hands together, who's ready to start running this company the right way? No one argued, because they all knew the real power had just shifted. The weight of the moment settled over the room like a thick fog. The man they had feared, the one who had ruled this company through arrogance and manipulation, was gone. and now all eyes were on Jordan. Some of the executives looked hesitant. Others looked intrigued, but none of them looked dismissive anymore. Jordan let the silence stretch for a moment before he spoke. "Let's be clear about something," he said, his voice calm but firm. "This company isn't what Marshall made it. It's what we allow it to be." He let his gaze sweep across the table. "And for too long, you let a man like him call the shots while you sat back and stayed quiet." Richard Vaughn, the older executive who had spoken earlier, cleared his throat. "And what exactly are you proposing, Jordan?" Jordan leaned back slightly, keeping his expression unreadable. "That depends," he said. "Are you asking because you want to see what comes next, or are you just trying to figure out where you fit in now that Marshall's gone?" Vaughn shifted in his seat. He wasn't used to being put on the spot. "We want stability," he said carefully. "The board wants to know if you can provide that." Jordan exhaled slowly. "Stability?" he repeated. "Or do you just want someone else to take the blame when things get uncomfortable?" A few of the executives looked away, embarrassed. "I don't care about stability," Jordan continued. "I care about making sure the people who actually run this company, the ones on the ground, the ones doing the real work, aren't getting crushed under people like Marshall ever again." He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice just enough to make them listen. "So, if you want stability, you should ask yourselves one thing. Are you willing to build something better, or do you just want another Marshall with a different face?" Silence. Then Denise spoke. "The board has already been discussing your future here, Jordan." He turned to her, unreadable. "Is that so?" She nodded. "They see what you've done. They know you exposed Marshall, and they know you have the backing of more people than you realize." She paused, then slid another document across the table. Jordan glanced at it, but he didn't touch it. "You're being offered an interim leadership position," Denise continued. "You'd have full executive authority until the board decides on the permanent CEO." A ripple of surprise went through the room. Some executives stiffened, others looked at Jordan with newfound consideration. Interim CEO. Jordan had fought for a lot of things in his life. He had spent years proving himself, working twice as hard just to be seen, just to be acknowledged. And now they were offering him the seat at the table. But that wasn't what mattered to him. He looked up, meeting Denise's gaze. "And what if I say no?" She studied him for a second. Then a small smile played on her lips. "Then we'll have to find someone else to clean up the mess Marshall left behind." Jordan let out a quiet breath. He turned his eyes to the document in front of him, then to the people around the table, the ones who had ignored him, underestimated him. And yet here he was. This wasn't just about a job. It was about changing the system from the inside, making sure no one else had to fight as hard as he had just to be seen. Slowly, he reached forward and picked up the pen. Every set of eyes in the room was on him. He clicked the pen once. Then, with steady hands, he signed his name. The game had changed. And this time, Jordan was the one making the rules. If you've ever had to fight to prove your worth, this one's for you. Don't just watch, make your voice heard. Like, comment and share if you stand for justice.